Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today what we're going to talk about is I'm going to touch on what makes a good shoe. And I think it's a really important conversation to have because I think where a lot of us are at the moment is potentially we're thinking about things a little bit differently than what we potentially should in terms of what makes a shoe good or what aspects of a shoe are important for you to look for when you're purchasing shoes. And I think it's an interesting conversation because this conversation of what makes a good shoe can technically be broken up into two separate conversations as well. The first one is, in a perfect world, what is an ideal shoe to work towards? And that's a conversation for everyone. However, there's a different conversation that we probably need to start with, which is what's the best shoe for you at the moment? And we'll get to both of those in a second. So if you can hang around to the end of the video, hopefully you'll get a good sense of maybe what you can do, what you should be looking for right now, with the views of what you should be transitioning towards as the years roll on. So I think clinically, I think it's a really important conversation because modern footwear, for lack of a better phrase, it stinks. It's not necessarily, from a general perspective, good for us in too many different ways. Now, the hallmarks of traditional footwear are things like a heel at the back, arch support, rigid soles, a narrow sort of toe end, and even a raised toe end as well for a lot of shoes, a lot of sneakers, a lot of runners, work shoes, business shoes. We're not even talking about dress shoes and traditional women's heels and things like that, but the underlying feature of most shoes is subpar mechanically. So, and this is why. So basically, I think the biggest thing to look at with your footwear is what kind of a heel does it have at the back of the shoe? Now, this is a women's boot, I guess, but as we see with a lot of sneakers, a lot of running shoes, a lot of business shoes, definitely, even kids' shoes these days, they seem to have a heel. And I think one of the reasons why we have a heel is with the best intentions, a heel's generally there to provide more cushioning. So if you're a runner, it makes sense in some levels or on some levels that extra heel means extra cushioning. And I think that's certainly an understandable technological advancement that shoes have had, but it comes at a cost. And one of the most important things to understand about footwear is that the amount of heel that your shoe has, so the differential between how raised the heel is compared to the toe, any differential is that exact amount of ankle range that you don't get access to while you're wearing those shoes. So if a shoe like this was a pair of shoes that you wear to work every day, or if they were a sneaker or a running shoe, and you spent a lot of time in a shoe with a raised heel, then over time you would start to reduce the available ankle range of motion that you have because you're not using it. And I think it's a really important concept to be aware of because stiff ankles, so ankle stiffness, if you've been watching these videos, if you've come in to see us clinically, you'll know that ankle stiffness is almost a centerpiece of a large majority of lower leg dysfunction, whether that's Achilles issues, shin splints, plantar fasciitis, flat feet, things like bunions, toe pain. You can have a lot of knee pain that can come from having stiff ankles. And from what I see clinically, the number one cause of ankle stiffness is a heeled shoe. Now that's closely followed by flip-flops / thongs, depending on where in the world you're from. And we can get to that in another video, but for the purposes of general footwear, any heel that you have is ankle range that you don't get access to. And if you're in that shoe often enough, you start to lose that ankle range. And as I said, it can be a problem clinically when you're trying to be athletic, you're trying to run as fast as you can, maybe you just want to have healthy knees, healthy feet and ankles. It throws a real spanner in the works if you wear a heel in your shoe. Now, as we were saying before, a lot of the conversations we want to have are split into two. So in an ideal world, in a perfect world, we should all be moving towards a shoe that doesn't have any heel at all, that's completely flat. Now, this may sound controversial to some people, but the reason why the ultimate goal should be flat is that our feet are flat. So our legs, and you don't need to see mine to see this, but we are born with all the heel that we need to survive. It's a cushioning system, it's a shock absorbing system that we have naturally inbuilt from the moment that we're born, the moment that we're walking. It develops into a system that we're supposed to have. Now, as I said before, in a perfect world, we would feel comfortable in shoes that are flat, that don't have any heel at all. But the problem with this conversation for a lot of people is that we've been in shoes that have a heel for so long that if we go straight to a flat shoe, all of a sudden we're trying to exist in a flat shoe, missing crucial ankle range of motion. And this is highlighted by, I think it was a study that was done, it'd be 5 or so years ago now, I can't remember specifically. And it was a really important study because what it showed is that people who transitioned from a traditional built-up running shoe with a thick heel to a minimalist shoe, a shoe that was flat, that had no heel, a large majority of those people developed injuries and dysfunction. And the problem with that study, if you can call it a problem, is that it led to a conclusion that said that heeled shoes are better for you, and as you transition down to a flat shoe, it creates more problems. And on the surface, that's absolutely true because that's what the study found. But what the study didn't do, and this is, I guess, an error in some of the thinking that we have around flat shoes, is that their transitioning to a flat shoe was just wearing a flat shoe incrementally more until their body got used to wearing a flat shoe. But what they didn't do is they didn't go after that long-standing lack of ankle range that they'd lost from being in built-up shoes for so long. So essentially what happens when you go from a built-up shoe to a flat shoe is that you're exposing years of rusty mechanics that you've accrued from being in a built-up shoe. So it makes perfect sense that if you have a stiff ankle and all of a sudden that heel isn't there to buffer that and hide that, your body's now going to have to find a way around it. So it's understandable that your Achilles might start to get sore, might get some plantar fasciitis, shin splints, maybe some knee pain, whatever dysfunction you may have. It's not because they transitioned to a flat shoe, it's because they did so without trying to undo the faulty mechanics that they'd accrued from being in a built-up shoe for so long. So it's a really important conversation to have because for people who don't like these shoes because they make them feel sore, you're actually exposing something that shouldn't be there. And that makes sense. So if you start to free up those ankles, and we've gone through some videos before on how to free up a stiff ankle with a band, I'll link to it up here. But as you start to decrease that ankle stiffness, you'll find that your ability to tolerate these shoes becomes better because you're taking away that mechanical dysfunction that prevents normal function in these shoes. And again, shoes without a heel are special in a sense because they're just trying to mimic what being barefoot is like, in a sense. So if you can't tolerate barefoot shoes or minimalist shoes, then essentially you can't tolerate being barefoot, which is a birthright. It's a normal expression of human function, but we just need to make sure that that other conversation we're having about maybe this is what ideal is, where transitioning to a heelless shoe is the ultimate goal because it's an expression of normal mechanics. The conversation that we need to have in the meantime is, well, what's best for you with your current situation? So obviously going from a heel shoe to no heel can open up a whole range of things you didn't know were under the surface. It can expose a lot of mechanical dysfunction. So what we need to do instead is, instead of going straight from a built-up shoe to a flat shoe, we do need to take your time coming down there as you are freeing up your ankles. So for someone who's been in heeled shoes forever, your immediate goal isn't to go straight to a flat shoe, it's to go to a shoe with less of a heel, provided that you are working on trying to free up and mobilize that ankle stiffness. So it's a progression down, but you've got to be working behind the scenes on those mechanical issues. So that's the first one. So the first piece of the puzzle is a heeled shoe or a shoe with a heel is horribly disadvantageous for normal leg function, and getting out of that and feeling more comfortable tolerating a flat shoe is the ultimate goal, because again, that shows that you can express normal mechanics, which is what we sort of look for clinically when we're trying to solve injuries and improve performance. So that's the end goal. So the next part of this, I guess, I've got to stop putting this down. The next part of this, and a strong feature of most modern shoes, are arch support. And the reason why arch support is really important, so these boots don't have arch support, but we know what it is. It's just the sort of a raised section of the shoe on the inner side of the shoe. So if this is the outside, this is the inside. We often see the inside raised to stop and support arches from collapsing. Now, it's the same concept that we were talking about before. If you need a heel or arch support to make your pain and dysfunction feel better, completely understandable, it's completely noble. But you've got to understand that the shoes that you're wearing, or if you need particular shoes to make your aches and pains feel better, these shoes are buffering bad mechanics. So you're never going to solve the problem or fix the underlying issues that cause your pain by staying in these shoes. You've got to be working towards getting out of them and feeling more comfortable in a flatter, less interesting shoe eventually. And it's the same concept with arch support, where it's great to have an arch in your shoe to help buffer a collapsing arch, but it doesn't stop the arch from wanting to collapse. So if we took you out of an arch supportive shoe, got you walking around bare feet, that arch is still going to want to collapse, and the shoe is really just there as a stopgap to make you feel better. And again, that's completely understandable if you need to just get some things done, but you've got to be making sure that you're working around that behind the scenes, so that you don't need to rely on those types of shoes anymore. Because again, your foot has all of the arch that it needs. From the age of about 6 years old, our arches develop. And again, I'll link this idea in another video that I think we've been through before, but the key with arch support and flat arches is that it's not a foot problem. So we'll go through this quickly because again, we've spoken about it before, but the idea that your arch collapses in the industry, and I think in the general public, we often feel like it's a foot specific problem where it's just the arch collapsing. But what we don't realize is it's the end result of a mechanical breakdown of the entire leg. So again, just to show you this quickly, hopefully you can see this on the video, but essentially, if you have flat feet and your arches collapse, if you look on this side, if I go from a good arch position to a flat arch position, watch what happens to my entire leg. So my entire leg has to rotate inwards in order for that arch to collapse. So if I'm putting an arch supportive shoe underneath that, I'm not stopping this mechanism from wanting to happen. I might be able to buffer it by sort of blocking it and stopping it from happening. But again, as soon as that shoe and that arch support comes away, that entire leg's going to dump forwards again. It's going to dump inwards, and that arch is going to collapse. So again, the conversations I want to promote here is that yes, it's important to have a shoe that makes you feel good at the moment, which again falls into this category of what's the best shoe for you right now. If you have an arch supportive shoe that you put them on and it feels like your symptoms are fantastic, whereas otherwise they're not, then that's completely understandable to exist in at the moment. But again, you've got to be working on your ankle flexibility and your hip mobility and your hip strength to make sure that that arch doesn't want to keep collapsing. So as you work on those three features, what you'll find is you'll be able to tolerate shoes with less arch support until you get to a shoe that feels flat with literally no support at all, because you don't necessarily need it if your leg is functioning correctly. So again, the ideal is a shoe that doesn't have a heel, that doesn't have arch support, because you don't need them. And that's an important distinction. So if you need them, it's compensating for something mechanical that you can change and that you can improve on so that you don't need it eventually. And I think that's something that we do as an industry and as a society relatively poorly at the moment, where we don't necessarily have the confidence to look beyond the symptomatic treatment to say, well, look, how do we stop needing that symptomatic treatment and fix the underlying problem? So that's important. So the third feature I think that's really important with a lot of shoes, and we see it a lot more in women's shoes, is the toe end of a shoe. Now, if we were to look at your feet now compared to maybe 20 years ago, depending on how old you are, you might find that when you were younger, your feet probably more closely resembled this, in a sense where your toes are relatively straight and it's broad. But a lot of us now, because of our shoes, and for some reason our shoes have become really pointy, is we probably find that a lot of your feet will look more like the shoe that you've been in for so long. And again, this is really important because your toes are designed to function really well in a straight position. So if we then take a shoe that compresses all of that, then all of a sudden you're turning your foot from this really broad, mobile, stable device into something that's very pointy. So your base of support will decrease a little bit. Your ability to push off and move is compromised because your toes and the end of your foot have started to morph towards the shoes that you've been wearing. So again, this one doesn't necessarily have as much to do with sort of mechanics as the heel and arch, but it's really important that we let those feet splay. And a really good test for this is when you get your toes, and my feet aren't perfect, but you should be able to fit a finger in between each one of your toes. And for me, my feet are still a little bit stiff, but the idea here is you should be able to get a finger in between each toe. And if you can't because it's stiff, then again, that's lost function that you have, and you deserve more than that. So I think the first three things to consider heels eventually want flat shoes, arch support, we eventually want flat shoes, pointy toes, we eventually want broader toes, toes that splay out. Now, the fourth thing I think is really important about modern footwear is that the soles are generally quite tough, and intellectually it does make sense. If you're someone who's working on hard surfaces, if you're out on gravel, if you're doing things where it can be quite uncomfortable for your feet, it makes sense that a thicker, maybe a stiffer sole is better. But again, the important feature about the foot is that the foot's malleable. So your foot has this amazing mechanical ability to be very sort of mobile, but also turn into a really rigid structure when you need to push off and run and walk. So if we have shoes that are quite rigid and stiff, then the foot itself becomes rigid and stiff because it doesn't have the capacity to consistently mold itself to its environment. So one of the things that I used to find really interesting is as a kid, a lot of people would feel very comfortable walking on gravel, going for a run down the street on a hard surface, walking over rocks, even sharper rocks isn't as big of a deal because we have a tendency as kids to spend more time barefoot. So we're consistently getting that interaction with these surfaces and we're sort of staying supple, staying strong. But as soon as we're sort of put into a modern day foot coffin, I guess, from a want of a better phrase, a better word, we lose that ability to mold ourselves to the environment. So as adults, there's so many people, particularly as we get a lot older, where walking outside is just too uncomfortable to do barefoot. Walking on gravel, walking on rocks is a no-go for a lot of people because we're losing or have lost that ability to tolerate those sort of harsher environments. And again, modern shoes aren't as malleable as they could be. So the best thing about barefoot shoes is that all they tend to do is offer you protection from the elements. They don't necessarily stop you from being able to express motion. It just offers a layer of protection, a sort of a stiffer layer of protection against modern things. If you're walking down the street, you're walking on glass, it'll hurt if you're barefoot, it won't if you've got a shoe on. But the idea I think that's really important here is that we don't spend enough time allowing our feet to just be feet. They're stuck inside these shoes, deprived from sensation. We've got socks and shoes, so we're really divorced a foot from the outside world. So I think those four features of modern shoes make them really poor in general. So if you have a heel, if you have arch support, if you have a pointy toe end, if you have a stiff, even a thick sole that really divorces the foot from the ground, then all we're doing is consistently down-regulating the function of our feet and our legs completely unnecessarily. So the thing I want to touch on with this, again, there will be a particular variation of shoes that you feel makes you feel comfortable, settles down to make some pains, gives you the confidence and the capacity to do more with your life. They're completely fine. But it's really important to understand that if your shoe has a heel or an arch support or a thick sole or a really rigid sole, it's going to come at a cost. It's going to rob you of basic function that you deserve to have and function that you need to have if you're going to solve a lot of the lower leg complaints that we have day to day. So again, if your ankles are stiff because you've been wearing your heel every day for 10 years, and that ankle stiffness is the foundation of dysfunction of your leg, yes, you can make that dysfunction feel better and you can treat those symptoms, but you can't truly rid yourself of that dysfunction until you get rid of the ankle stiffness and then you take away the context that asks that ankle to be stiff in the first place. So hopefully that makes sense. So in terms of a recommendation, the best thing to do is not to go from a built-up shoe to a flat, barefoot, minimalist shoe straight away. You can if you've got good function. Again, you might need to speak with a physical therapist or a podiatrist or someone in that field to know how far you can leap. But for most people, it's just a product of becoming less involved as your shoes evolve. So you want to go from a built-up shoe to slightly less built up to slightly less built up. And as long as you're working on the stiffnesses and the tightnesses that we get from being in modern shoes, then you should find it's a seamless transition to being barefoot in barefoot shoes. And as always, the thing that we want to promote is what's the broader context here. And I think a really powerful message to leave you with today is that being barefoot is important. It's normal and natural and vital for basic foot health and foot function. So any opportunity that you get to be barefoot more, please take it. If that means definitely being barefoot inside, that's a no-brainer. But if you take the dog out for a walk and it's just a short walk, maybe just don't wear shoes. Or if you're at the park and you can take your shoes off, please do. Just know that it will take some time for your body or your feet to desensitize, to get more mobile and stronger again. But just being barefoot helps sort of feed and water those seeds of function. And in no time, it'll start to come back and you'll feel completely different. So hopefully that information is useful. As always, let me know in the comments below if you have particular shoes that you're not sure about. Maybe post a photo, leave it in the comments, let us know, and we'll make sure to comment back and sort of give you some advice on how you can improve those shoes. And if you found this information really useful, it would be great if you could let us know by leaving a like below. And also consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. Again, it helps this information get out to more people. And I think clinically, this stuff is really underrated. It's a foundation of a lot of dysfunction. And unfortunately, modern shoes are definitely aesthetically pleasing and they look fantastic, but there's so many popular shoes on the market at the moment that are horrible functionally. So it's really important that we sort of distinguish those ideas, because you're allowed to have a good pair of shoes that you think look really nice, but if they're not functional, maybe they're shoes that you shouldn't wear as often. Save them for a special occasion, so that when you're working hard on reclaiming that function, you know, a couple of hours in a built-up shoe that's not fantastic for you, much like junk food, it won't break the bank. So again, hopefully that was useful. And then again, I'll bring out something on sort of thongs or flip-flops, depending on where in the world you're from, and maybe the next video or the one after. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time.